OK. Well, let's talk about one part of it, the renewing of guidance over 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in England to prevent their blanket use in areas where it's not appropriate. Does that mean that it is not up to local councils and areas to decide whether or not a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit is appropriate?
No, we want to stick with the position where 20-mile-an-hour speed limits make perfect sense, for example, outside a school or in a heavily built-up area where, you might have children playing in a residential area, or where there's a particular issue with accidents, for example. In those areas, it makes perfect sense. What we're against and what we're looking at strengthening guidance about is avoiding the blanket imposition of a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, like we've seen in Wales, where it's a blanket imposition, irrelevant to the conditions, the Labour government in Wales has introduced, which just makes life harder for drivers, doesn't deliver any benefits, actually damages the ability of 20-mile-an-hour speed limits to make people safer, because if you put them in inappropriate places, actually people are less likely to comply even where they make sense. So it's this blanket imposition
and
that
that's
doesn't
the decision
make
of
sense.
a devolved government. And I think it's clear then that you would not do the same across
Correct.
England. But why is it not for a local area to decide what is appropriate for them? Why, judging by what you're saying, you would then ban a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit beyond the specific cases you mentioned, built-up areas, schools, etc.?
No, we're saying it's perfectly sensible for a local authority to look at specific circumstances, as they can do now, and say, have a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit outside a school or in an area where it makes sense. What isn't sensible is a blanket imposition across a whole area that doesn't look at those specific local conditions. We've seen that's what's happened in Wales. It's incredibly unpopular, makes life difficult for drivers, makes life difficult actually for bus companies to deliver sensible services to people that depend on it. And it also makes it less likely then that people comply with 20-mile-an-hour zones in areas where they do make sense,
but if
that actually doesn't help people keep people safe.
A local authority did that, they are accountable, aren't they? If people don't like it, they can vote them out of being in control of that area.
But we're strengthening the guidance so that it'll be harder for people to have blanket impositions of these policies. We want them put in place where they make sense. And that actually, I think, it's a common sense decision that I think people will support.
So which in England have not made sense then?
Well, look, there are. It's the blanket imposition. We've seen what's happened in Wales.
Yes. Where in England has that been a problem? Which ones are you opposed to?
We want to make sure that doesn't happen in England. We want to make sure that life is made easier for drivers, and you put these 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in place where they make sense based on the local conditions,
so there
not
is
a blanket.
No problem.